like to introduce Wayne Linklater, who is speaking on the culture of conservation. Now, Wayne is the Associate Professor in the of Conservation Science at Victoria University in Wellington. He leads research in New Zealand on new technologies for pest mammal control and the human dimensions of environmental and wildlife management. He's currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at the University of California, and he's joining us, as you can see, by video conference for his presentation and Q&A afterwards. So welcome, Wayne, and thanks so much.
For two reasons. First, conservation is done better when it includes a diversity of voices and values, especially from the wider community who are most impacted by environmental and conservation decisions. Any attempt to impose unacceptable objectives, tools or strategies on an unwilling public is frankly not good for the nation, and it's not good for conservation in the long run. Second, environments and ecologies are complex. There are no simple solutions to our conservation and environmental challenges. The solutions will necessarily require that we dig much more deeply into environmental and conservation science to entertain and apply a great diversity of approaches and solutions at different places at different times. Pretending, as we seem to, that the science and solutions are simple and deciding that there's only one solution or tool for the problem is a surefire way to alienate people like you, whose support is actually necessary for progress. So I'm going to begin by using the last government's Predator-Free 2050 as an example of how the conservation culture and politics in New Zealand fails. I'm going to ask why we can end up with such flawed policies, and then propose a way of doing things differently. And then I'm going to talk about what I think this means for groups like yours that are working to try and gain a greater say in conservation, for it to be done differently, or at least to incorporate your values or a wider set of values. Many of you will already be aware that I've written about the Predator-Free policy and program, and you can find out more about that online. And I can send you papers like this one that were published in Conservation Letters towards the end of last year, if you want greater detail.
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. So grab my email address and send me a request, and I'm happy to forward you a PDF of these sorts of documents. Predator-Free by 2050 policy's intention to exterminate stoats, possums and rats from the entire country by the year 2050 is flawed. And it's flawed for a number of reasons which are outlined in detail in these sorts of papers. I'm just going to I don't want to revisit that here, but I'm just going to summarise quickly what the major flaws are. The first is that the first assumption that's flawed is that predator extermination is everywhere and all the time the most effective strategy for protecting biodiversity. The second assumption that's flawed is that to protect and recover our nation's biodiversity, we need to eradicate every last stoat, rat and possum. And the third assumption or premise is that complete eradication is possible. None of these are true. Decades of ecological science and conservation experience and practice supports this conclusion. A more science-informed and effective policy was possible, and I've called this alternative strategy Aotearoa, or Nature Plus New Zealand. We have the ability to reverse New Zealand's biodiversity decline to a biodiversity gain in a single decade if we would only focus on biodiversity instead of predators and apply our science and experience to the problem. Lastly, on this topic, I want to say that the Predator-Free 2050 policy is also based on the flawed premise that the outcomes will be wholly positive. This is also unlikely to be true. Complexity of New Zealand's socio-ecological system means that some negative social, ethical, and ecological consequences will result Some of those will be unexpected and some unrecoverable. Moreover, the policy is proving to be causing an increase, not a decrease, in environmental conflicts in this country. That's not good for us or progress in solving the environmental challenges that this country faces. For example, Predator-Free 2050 will require that 1080 be used more, not less. Although, as an ecologist working in New Zealand, I've been aware for 2 decades now that scientists and policymakers have been preparing for a time when 1080 would no longer be acceptable to use. We've been talking about this for 2 decades. That's why the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment funded research like mine to find better ways of controlling pests. I want to move on now to the next stage in my analysis to ask, how did we end up with such a flawed policy? How did we end up with such a deeply flawed, what I've called bombastic biodiversity conservation policy? To answer this question, I'm going to talk about the conservation culture in New Zealand and propose an alternative cultural response to our environmental challenges. While guided by information, some of it scientific, conservation is a values-based endeavour driven by culture. It is a subjective cultural judgment about what is good and bad. It's a representation of our values. And our conservation culture is strongly driven by what we call in the industry dualisms, especially in New Zealand. And these are binary value judgments about the environment. The dominant dualism is the human nature dualism. People and nature are regarded as different and separate. And consequently, when we intervene to conserve environments, we more commonly seek to exclude people or make nature more like it would have been without or before people. And so a type of puritanical nature restoration is a dominant influence in New Zealand conservation, seeking to return nature to how it was before people arrived. I'm a big supporter of the sanctuaries movement, and I think sanctuaries, biodiversity sanctuaries of all sorts and with a variety of objectives, are an important part of the solution. But they also illustrate some of our sillier intentions. This is the intention, the vision statement for Zealandia, the fence sanctuary in the middle of Wellington City. That it has a 500-year vision to restore Wellington Valley's forest and freshwater ecosystems to as closely as possible to their pre-human state. Yeah, I think I'm interpreting the laughter appropriately when I say that such visions might be great for flag waving, but they lack credibility. Dualisms extend to biodiversity. We place a cultural value judgment on biodiversity as good or bad depending on its relationship with people. This dualism also sets our nation up to regard these different biodiversities as also in conflict. It's native against invasive. We believe that conservation must try to make biodiversity pre-human. Let me be absolutely clear, because it's often not clear from my colleagues in science. Science does not and cannot support these dualisms. Science can tell us where a species live, how many there are, and how their populations and distributions change. And it can measure how species influence ecosystems. But it cannot tell us whether that species' effects are good or bad. That is a cultural value judgment. I'm aware that many of my colleagues in this debate very often transcend into making cultural value judgments that they don't acknowledge as such and pretend like they're scientific.
Correct.
Nonetheless, people have changed environments and biodiversity in ways that some judge to have been mistakes. The cultural response to acknowledging those as mistakes is to then feel remorse. And of course, almost daily in news sites, conservationists express their remorse for biodiversity lost or declining. And that remorse is framed as a motivator for doing things differently. And that's a good thing. But because we see the world in human versus nature confrontational dualisms, our remorse also comes with self-loathing and the attribution of blame. We blame our own species, of course, which just reinforces the false human nature dualism, but we blame other species too because they came with us. The advantage, though, of blaming another species is that instead of changing our own unsustainable behaviour, we can launch a self-congratulatory cultural war on an introduced species. And that's what we've done. These are phrases from press releases from leaders of Predator Free 2050 Limited. That Predator Free 2050 is a project born in a leap of faith, that it's a call to arms and a fight back, a multi-year mission, a battle to kill rats and stoats, by an army of volunteers who are the unsung heroes of this crusade, and the need to attract young people to the campaign, the need for new weapons, and that such crusades spur innovations. And if we add to that the tendency for our Department of Conservation to create programs like War on Weeds and Battle for Our Birds, it becomes apparent that from individuals to communities and to the highest level of government, our conservation response to environmental challenge is to wage war on nature. War is used to justify the widespread use of poisons to suppress and attempt to eradicate introduced species. In summary, here's my model for how our conservation culture generated Predator Free 2050. Our conservation culture is founded on dualisms and confrontation. Our ancestors colonised New Zealand's environments and biodiversity. They successfully dominated and subjugated it in the traditions of our culture. We are remorseful about that colonisation, and we are trying to atone and rectify our mistakes by seeking to return our environment back to how it was before we arrived. Conservation in New Zealand is therefore a deeply historically referenced, nostalgic and backwards facing. We blame ourselves, and expediently and unscrupulously we blame the species we brought with us too. We call them invasive species, immigrant killers and aliens. And so we've constructed a conservation program to wage a religious war on the immigrants, invaders and foreigners. The great tragedy of our conservation culture is that it means we haven't actually stopped colonising nature in this country. We've only shifted from a war on native and endemic species to a war on the species we brought with us. Our cultural relationship with nature in this country has not changed. We are still attempting a nationwide subjugation of nature. I think it's time we had a new conservation culture in this country. And it must be a conservation culture that can cope and take advantage of environmental changes, because the world and nature is changing. It always has changed and it always will. We are living in the time known as the Anthropocene, when every place on the planet is changed by people. Any past changes like species introductions or arrivals like rats are irretrievable. Future changes like warming atmosphere might be managed, but they cannot be stopped. Future environments will be unable to support the biodiversity of the past. A conservation culture founded on dualisms, remorse and confrontation is a conservation culture designed to resist change, but not any good at sustaining biodiversity or making it resilient to future challenges. So I want to suggest that we reform our conservation culture from one about dualisms and confrontation to one that appreciates that environments and biodiversity are complex and adapting, and we need to adapt too. Then let's make our primary focus conservation's foundation principle, sustainability. We must do all we can to live within the environment's limits, within the environmental limits of the planet. That's a no-brainer. Third, we should actively seek to stop our guilt and living in the past by reconciling with environmental change. We need to accept the limits of our control. We need to move from being historically referenced to future focused. Fourth, we just simply need to end the self-loathing and blame. People and their commensal and domestic animals are a part of nature. There are no bad or evil natures or species on the road to sustainability, just more sustainable choices. And lastly, let's end government policies for environmental war and replace those with science-informed policy of the sort that supports sustainability. Our cultural regard and response to environmental change is at the heart of debates about what to conserve and how to do it. We can try to resist environmental change by restoring old ecosystems to historical conditions and to eradicate introduced species from our nation. We can try, but we won't succeed. It's fanciful. The attempt is a futile war on environmental change. Predator-free 2050s are 19th century European colonist policy making in a 21st century world. I'm proposing a new strategy to replace Predator-free 2050. Greater environmental and biodiversity gains can be made if we embrace change to build the sustainable ecosystems of the future. Taio Tapere Aotearoa, Nature Plus New Zealand. What does that mean for people like you who want to see conservation in New Zealand done differently? My recommendation is that you don't enter fights with others about evidence or their science. That's not at issue here. It's a distraction. Instead, raise your voices and communicate your values. Tell New Zealand what you want the future of New Zealand to be. Give them a greater environmental vision for this country that transcends the silly and old thinking and the confrontation with nature. Thank you.